Maps of Meaning Mondays. Every Monday I'd like to go over some parts of Maps of Meaning. I hope to do it sequentially. I think the next slide talks about that. So what's the plan? I'm calling it Mo Meaning Mondays. I think it's better than anything else I've seen. So I want to analyze 1 or 2 pages at a time depending on the content, because I noticed some have graphics and so forth. I haven't read ahead. I'll just be reading whatever I present here. And I figure that this will give the channel some more rhythm when you pair it with my Fearful Symmetry Fridays. In this video specifically, besides just the page 1 that I want to get to, I want to go over briefly the index so that you get a feel for the nature of the book. Then I'd like to examine briefly the biblical quote that Jordan uses to open the book. It's the first thing he puts in there, I think. I'm going to look at the first paragraph of the preface, not the whole preface. I'm going to save the whole thing for another video, but I think just the first paragraph is interesting for us today, as well as the title of the preface, Descensus ad Inferos. I'm going to examine the first page, breaking it down sentence by sentence, maybe 2 or 3 times, so that it's very clear what exactly Peterson's saying, because I think, as Paul Vanderklay said, the writing can get somewhat tortured. And I think it's because Peterson did go over every sentence over and over again. What did he say, 30 times? 20 or 30 times to see how best it could be said. But I think, you know, there's something to that. I mean, he did say what he meant to say, I guess. And then I'd like to touch on how this book, Maps of Meaning, is pretty much laying out the Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson debates that are coming out now more clearly with audio. I still haven't listened to them, but you can tell exactly from their interviews that this book is laying out the foundations for the debate. And I want to explore how myth is not proven false by science, but rather myth suggests science is just another story. And I don't mean this to be any kind of Bible science or anything like that, because I know some people think that the Bible can prove itself scientifically, and somehow this kind of puts secular science to the side. I don't mean to say that, and if you're curious about what I mean, hopefully you can stick around towards the end of the video and find out. So I have actual pictures here of my book and the index, and they might be hard to see if you're on a cell phone, but if you're on a computer or watching this on TV, you can kind of get a clue for what's happening in the book from the index. And I just made some notes here, my own observations. Usually it's about the frequency with which something's mentioned, like Aaron, Abel, Abraham, and Adam. Those are all biblical mentions. And versus Achilles, which is a Greek mythological reference. I think, you know, there's, compared to the biblical references in this page, there's just one Achilles, but there's all those other biblical references. And then over here I noted that the other thing I note is sort of like the science aspect of the book versus the mythological, legendary, or religious parts. So you have acts, affect, adaptation. These are signifying the scientific rigors of the book. And then you have alchemical, alchemist, and alchemy, well represented here. Very, very represented. So I'm just going to sample a few of these index pages so you can get a feel for it. Here I have listed dogma, dragon, drama, and dream. They're highly represented here in the book. Elements, Eliad is someone he references often. Embodied and emotion. So dogma is sort of a religious term. Dragon, drama, and dream, these are a mix of psychoanalysis and and human history with drama. This page I have death, descent, and despair. These are well represented. Lots of mentions of death. It kind of gives you a little insight into perhaps his state of mind when he was writing the book. Destruction, devil, and disillusion. Again, some religious aspect there with the devil making an appearance in this book quite significantly, actually. Eve, evil, evolution, error, episodic memory. Here's a good mix of religion, science, Eve, evil, evolution for the science, error for the science, episodic memory for the science, explicit and exploration on this side here. On this page I noted Genesis, goal, God, and gold. Kind of interesting. Hand, heaven, and hawking. Hawking is mentioned, I think, all of once. Yes, once on page 412. And then you have all the rest are kind of religious. This is alchemical, I assume, and goal is probably psychological. Heaven religious, Genesis religious, God religious, of course. There's lots of God references. Here I have idea, image, and imagination. Imagination is heavily referenced, and image as well. Individual and information. Information, again, gives it that little bit of science, that throw in some science there, or some philosophy. Nietzsche, night, nihilism, normal, objective. That's quite a smattering of philosophical and scientific, perhaps philosophical and scientific are combined with the objective. Old Testament, order, Osiris, and pain. And here you have the religious, the psychological, biological perhaps, and he threw in some something outside the Bible, the Osiris myth. On this part of the index, I've noted past, patriarchal, pattern, peace, and personality are highly represented. Phenomenology, philosophical, play, Plato, and possessed are also noted. Here we get some of the Greek with Plato, although it's not that much compared to everything else. There's just a handful of references to Plato. Here we have reality, reason, redemption, religion, representation, another interesting mix of philosophy and science and religion here. Responsibility, resurrection, revolution, right hemisphere, it's a science part, ritual, science, religion, science, religion. You see that repeatedly, heavily represented in the index. Here's the actual picture of the title page of my book. It's signed Jordan Peterson, 2017. That's because I bought it when he was offering them on Patreon, and I signed up for that offer, and it took several months for him to produce the book, because I think at that time he got a huge surge of people wanting to buy his book through that method. But it was worth it, and as soon as I got it, I started digging into, like, you might think, well, why haven't I read it by now? I just started digging into everything that Peterson read to write the book. So I started reading a lot of Jung's collected works and other books. His autobiography was the first thing I read. The Red Book, and so forth. We're going to get into a little bit of the Red Book here. And I started reading some of Eliade and Nietzsche, more Nietzsche. I was a philosophy major, so I was familiar with them somewhat. And so forth. And then I started getting into Northrop Frye and William Blake. William Blake is my most recent kick, as you can probably tell. And he's made quite an impression on me, because William Blake really had a lot of these ideas, and he saw a lot of the conflict that you're seeing between Peterson and Sam Harris, and the overall cultural conflict. Blake saw it way back in the early 1800s, or the late 1700s even, when I think he started writing Jerusalem in the early 1800s. And I think he died around 1827 or so, so it's nothing past that. But Blake had a lot of ideas that you'll find start to surface in Nietzsche, in Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Jung. And Jung did refer to Blake a little bit, but he dismissed him because Blake was too aware of what he was trying to represent in his artwork. Jung was looking for unconscious things being represented in artwork, whereas Blake was totally conscious of everything he was putting in his artwork. He was trying to recover paradise. He was trying to restore the biblical narrative through his art. And so that wasn't of interest to Jung. And if you look into Peterson, he does not cite William Blake, I don't think, at all. But he really should. He should start digging into it. I mean, he cites Northrop Frye plenty, and Northrop Frye was basically heavily influenced by William Blake. And it's a shame that William Blake never got any kind of recognition while he was alive, and he barely gets any, or got any, when he started to have a little bit of a resurgence with Northrop Frye, and Damrosch, I think, is the other notable Blake scholar. But even to this day, you'd think with Peterson sort of gave Jung another resurgence, but nobody's looking back to Blake, and it's a shame because there's so much there that they could find useful. Anyway, that was kind of a long aside. Here's the first thing Peterson puts in the book. It's a quote from Matthew chapter 13, verse 35. "I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world." And that sounds very daunting to me. Very interesting as well. What a way to open a book. So if you look at a little bit of context for the quote, this was around the parables. Jesus was talking about the yeast and the mustard seed. And so Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, quote, "I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world." And so this is what Peterson decides to quote here. And I find it funny that lately he's been criticized for speaking obvious truths. And I think you have to dig it in a little bit here to understand what's going on. So let's dig in, because there's a little, this is a reference to the Old Testament, which is, where was it? I think Isaiah. Is it Isaiah 78? I think it's Isaiah. So here, what Jesus is quoting there, here's the real context that I think sheds even more light on Peterson, what Peterson's doing, interestingly enough. "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, shewing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength, and his wonderful works that he hath done." Now I added a little bit of thing here, weak versus strong. I'll get to that afterwards. "For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God." So I did some highlighting here. The dark sayings of old, and which our fathers have told us. I think the reason why Peterson is being criticized for telling obvious truths is because these are supposed to be the truths that our fathers should have passed down to us. They're supposed to come from our traditions. They're supposed to come from our rituals and our myths and our religions, and specifically this religion, the Jewish religion, the Judeo-Christian belief. This is where we're supposed to get this, but it wasn't coming down to us through our culture. Our culture was stripping this away rather systematically. And so when Jordan wrote this book, I think he understood that that these are the sayings that we're not going to know about, especially 20 or 30 years after writing the book, generation after generation, not hearing the truths as they should be heard. Jordan's here to kind of lay it out for us. And he also, what he also does is he bridges the gap between the truths that are written in a first phase language, which I go over in the Jordan Peterson God Question, and our third phase understanding of language, which is much more concrete. So Jordan does a sort of translating affair of translating the poetic into a scientific, concrete language. And like I said, I haven't read the Maps of Meaning book yet, except for the first page and the preface. But I hope to see a lot more of this translating as I go. But this part about strength, I think, is interesting. Shewing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength. And I think this just reminded me, for some reason, of Jordan talking about speaking the truth. And when he's asked to elaborate on that, he'll say that he was saying things that made him feel weak. And so there you have something negative, maybe something that's not godlike. He wants to be strong. He wants to have the strength of the Lord. And that is through speaking truth. And I don't know, for some reason that just really stuck to me there. And anyway, that's all right from this first little quote here he has. Now, I found it also interesting that the Red Book by Jung, which wasn't published, I believe, openly until 2012, there's a whole history behind the Red Book. I don't know if I should go into it here or not, or if you want to look it up, or if it's too much of a pain to ask you to look it up. I'm going to try to shorten it. The gist of it is that Jung had a period of time before the First World War, and I think during the First World War, where he had a sort of breakdown, and some people thought he really went crazy, and other people say it couldn't have been exactly that he went crazy, because nobody goes crazy and then gets better for it. They usually decline. I think Peterson makes that point. Jung actually, in this breakdown, I think Jung calls it a search for his soul, where he makes a connection with his soul. Jung documented these fantasies he had. I think the first one, he was sitting in his library, and he was consciously trying to imagine something. He was trying to let his unconscious mind take over, so to speak. I think he called it active imagination. So he was sitting there trying to do this experiment, if you will, so-called experiment. And he saw a staircase of stone appear on his floor, and it just went down and down. And he went down these stairs. I think he described it as for ages or something like that. So anyway, he had these fantasies using his active imagination technique. And he recorded these fantasies in black books, these black leather-bound books, sort of like a dream journal. But these were waking dreams. And so he had several of these experiences, recorded them, and then he started recording them in a red book, a large folio edition with artwork in it, his original artwork. And he sort of shared this just with a few confidants, a few friends, some of his family. It wasn't widely known. He made oblique references to it, like this was the time when I had a certain breakthrough, and he found the archetypes. He made contact with them. He described them. This is where a lot of basically his life's work all happened to him, and with him. He experienced it in that period of time. And so from the Red Book, he drew out all his later scientific work. But this Red Book was not widely known or published until 2012. So Peterson probably didn't really know about it exactly, unless he got access to some like Jung archive, and you know, who knows, maybe he did. But so Jung opens up his Red Book with quotes from the Bible. He quotes the Luther translation, I think the Luther German Bible, and so let's read it here. There is a point to this. Who has believed our message, and to whom the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. It's Isaiah 53. And I explained what the Red Book was. I wasn't sure if I was going to do that. But so Jung writes 3 passages from the Bible in Latin. And from these first 3 verses, he noted, the birth of the Savior, the development of the redeeming symbol, takes place where one does not expect it, and from precisely where a solution is most improbable. You'll hear Peterson sort of quote a Latin saying to that effect that Jung often quoted as well. He also quotes Isaiah 9:6 and John 1:14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. It's interesting because Peterson will sometimes go back to that Word made flesh and the Gospel of John. And what's interesting there is that John was trying to take the Jewish religious idea of truth and God and bring it to the Greeks, or bring it into Greek philosophy. And he was trying to reconcile the 2 ideas, and this was an interesting way of doing it, saying that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and so forth. And again, I think go back to my Fearful Symmetry 3 video, where I talk about the genius of Christianity. There's so much happening. It's so complicated, and it's so interconnected, and it all seems to work and ring true. And truer, the deeper you go, the more true it seems and appears. And it's just all very fascinating. And I don't think I'm going to dive too deep into it right now. But the way that relates, though, to us, there was a reason for me saying that, is that we have an idea, much like the Greeks do, of some objective truth out there that we align our perceptions to and our thinking to, and that's what Sam Harris is getting at with the world of objects, which we're going to get to in page 1. The world of objects is sort of like that Greek idea of truth, and Peterson is like that writer of the Gospel of John, who's trying to bring us to this other understanding that works with that idea of objects, but says it's not exactly what you think. There's this thing called the Logos. There's actually a structure to being, and you have to understand that structure. It's somewhat rational, it's known, but it's also unknown. It's left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and there's a reason why we have our brain structured that way, and that's what McGilchrist gets into a lot, Ian McGilchrist. Our brains are structured this way for a reason, and there's a reason why every other animal on Earth also has a divided brain that also similarly is equipped to deal with the world in these 2 different ways. Anyway, so Jung writes of the hidden knowledge of the unconscious in the Red Book, and opens with the biblical quotes. Jordan is writing about the hidden knowledge in myth and tradition. And this is interesting because, like, how could our traditions be hidden from us? Well, they've been stripped away slowly over time. The culture war, I guess. So here we have the preface, and like I said, I'm just going to go over the first paragraph. I think he has a quote from Jung here. I don't know if this is all a quote from Jung or if it's just this little paragraph here. But I thought this was interesting. He has this preface and he calls it Descensus ad Inferos. And so this is descent into hell in the most modern sense, usually Christ's descent into hell after he was crucified and was buried. He descended into the dead. Is it hell? Is it the dead? Is it Hades? It was more originally Hades, and it was even more originally understood, apparently, as the descent to the lower regions, lower and higher. These are a metaphor. It wasn't understood to be hell originally. And I got sucked into a hole here. I went down the rabbit's hole into looking into this, And there's just so much here that I thought I'd go into it, but it'd probably be another hour just to scratch the surface of what was going on with this phrase. There's Inferos and Inferos or something, and there's just a lot of history to what happened with this understanding of Christ descending into hell or to Hades or to the lower regions of the dead, what that meant to Jews and to what it meant to early Christians and so forth. But just know that this is an interesting title, and of course Peterson, he definitely knows what's going on here. He may not, maybe he doesn't know like N.T. Wright knows, but he definitely knows that this is certainly fitting for his preface, I would think. And so the first paragraph says, in case you can't read it here, something we cannot see protects us from something we do not understand. The thing we cannot see is culture, in its intrapsychic or internal manifestation. The thing we do not understand is the chaos that gave rise to culture. If the structure of culture is disrupted, unwittingly, chaos returns. We will do anything to defend ourselves against that return. I thought that was very interesting, and it reminded me of this little passage from Northrop Frye. Again, I'll quote him often. He's just what's on my mind recently. Every time I read a book, I tend to start looking at everything else I read and see through the lens of that book. And I think Peterson has, through Frye, Eliade, Nietzsche, Jung, he has all these different lenses, and he's building a telescope. And so if you're going to see the way Peterson sees things, you have to include all these different lenses from all these different books and philosophies and ways of looking at the world. And the pragmatists, I haven't gotten into William James, although I did buy a book. Interestingly enough, you might say it's somehow synchronous, but I bought a book from that William James wrote. I think, what's it called? The Will to Believe or something, way back in college before I understood anything. And not that I understand a lot now, I'm still learning. But I happen to have picked that up, and it's been sitting on my shelf, and I never got into it. And now all of a sudden I'm thinking I should probably get into that. But anyway, here Frye says, man lives not directly or nakedly in nature like the animals, but within a mythological universe, a body of assumptions and beliefs developed from his existential concerns. Most of this is held unconsciously, which means that our imaginations may recognize elements of it when presented in art or literature without consciously understanding what it is that we recognize. And here he was writing, I think, just as Jung was writing, and I think they were writing in two different languages. Obviously, Frye was writing in English, and Jung was probably writing in Swiss or German. And I don't know if Jung's works were published early on when this was written. I think this was written in the 40s, the early 40s. I'm not sure. But Frye seems to understand something of, as a literary critic, something of the universality of art and literature, that people cross-culturally can understand symbols, they can understand what's going on in a piece of art and react accordingly psychologically. And so this is part of what Jung would understand and illuminate as the collective unconscious, that there is something genetically built into our brains and our psychology that is image and symbol, and it's very deeply rooted in us, and we're never going to get rid of it. That's why when the atheists try to extract religion, a lot of religion is symbolic and imagistic. That's why Jonathan Pajot, as an icon carver, he's tapping into these archetypal ancient imagery that's resurfacing in anything you want to say. Like the modern take of it would perhaps be Christianity, but these symbols go way back. Anyway, I don't think I have to read the whole quote. I do read the whole quote in other videos, I think one or two other videos, because it is an interesting quote. But of note here, comparing to the preface of Peterson's book there, Maps of Meaning, Mo Meaning, culture, myth, existential, unconscious, art, literature, socially conditioned, a psychological inheritance, and mythological conditioning. So he says here, one of the practical functions of criticism, by which I mean the conscious organizing of a cultural tradition, is, I think, to make us more aware of our mythological conditioning. Peterson wants to make us more aware of our mythological conditioning. And I think that's where he's getting into a spat with Sam Harris and Dillahunty. Now, I did see the Dillahunty talk. I did not see the Sam Harris talks yet. But there you have, he's trying to say, you are mythologically conditioned by Christianity in a Christian culture to think a certain way, to react a certain way. And I think I'm also a follower of Gad Saad, and I love Gad Saad. I was following Gad before I was following Peterson. And but I think Gad, I don't know why he doesn't seem to understand his mythological conditioning. And particularly him and Nassim Taleb. They both come from, I believe, the same area in the Middle East, Lebanon, right? I think it's Lebanon. And you know, I think they both experienced to some extent the civil war there. Gad Saad particularly. So Gad is sort of a Jew in a Muslim predominated, or you know, a culture. So he understands what it is to be Jewish, that religion. He understands. Now, he's not a religious Jew. He understands Islam to some extent, having been in that culture. And then he understands, I guess to some extent, living in Canada, a Canadian, a Christian society, or that's, you know, soaked in the mythological structures of Christianity, as Jordan tries to point out. How does Gad Saad not realize that he's not just, as Vanderklay says, a product of a intellectual clean room? You know, he's been soaked in so many different cultures of mythological and psychological conditioning and inheritance that it's hard to fathom how he thinks he's getting everything from his rational mind. But this video is not about Gad Saad, so I'll move on. So Maps of Experience, page 1. Here we have Maps of Experience. Oh yeah, this reminded me of William Blake's Songs of Experience. And maybe is it just because they're experience and experience? I don't think so. Because here William Blake, I had just read within the last couple of months all of William Blake's work, so it's about like 1,000 pages of poetry, and much of it is very cryptic. His epic poems are very cryptic pieces of work. Maybe that's why it's kind of drew me in, because you really have to work to understand William Blake. But so in the Songs of Experience, he has an introduction calling man back from the brink of destruction, from a singular reliance on reason alone. Blake is trying to say there's more than just reason. You're forgetting that reason's just a tool. There's imagination from which everything sort of springs. McGilchrist might see this as Blake chastising his culture for relying too heavily on the left hemisphere, calling for a restored balance between the emissary and his master. That's the title of McGilchrist's book. McGilchrist also did an interesting talk to the William Blake Society, I think. That's worth looking into. Of course, he goes over his thesis in his book about the left and right hemispheres, primarily trying to cite Blake. I don't think he cited, I mean, McGilchrist is a genius. I'd love to see him and Peterson go on tour instead of Peterson and Rubin. Rubin's nice. Maybe just add McGilchrist to that team, and to see that tour would be incredible. Anyway, the way is not clear if you have no eye to see it, if your vision is lacking. And I think that's what we're going to start to see with Peterson and Sam Harris and in Maps of Meaning, and a Blake vision in a Blakean sense. So Maps of Experience. Maps are guides to the world. It's interesting factoid that the earliest known maps are of the stars, not of the Earth. Dots mapping the skies go back to 14,500 BC, found in caves. Maps are representations, or as McGilchrist would say, representations of the real world, or of the world out here that we assume is there. They condense information and they abstract things from reality. And Blake would call that a subtraction. And it is. If you look at a map, it's nothing like looking at the real surface of the Earth or whatever you're mapping. It's a subtraction from it. It's certain mathematical principles and details. Anyway, moving on. Experience, so that was the maps part, and now the experience part, is the knowledge or mastery of an event or subject gained through involvement in or exposure to it. Terms in philosophy such as empirical knowledge or a posteriori knowledge are used to refer to knowledge based on experience. So we should expect an abstraction, the map part, an abstraction of knowledge. But what knowledge? Well, object and meaning. And here we're getting into Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Object and meaning, certainly. How can we draw meaning from objects? That would be Jordan's question. Okay, so he says the world can be validly construed as forum for action or as place of things. I think that's a little bit awkwardly phrased, but like Vanderklee said, the text can get tortured. But maybe that's exactly what he wanted to say. I mean, it is the first sentence of the book. The world can be validly construed as forum for action or as place of things. Place of things. Anyway, that kind of sounds odd to me. So can be reasonably understood, not is. So the way I'm reading that here is can be. It's not a binary choice, either or. It's open to possibility. So I thought that was an interesting way of phrasing it. It leaves things open to perhaps more than just a form for action and a place of things, but it certainly can be construed. And I think I harp on this construed for a little bit. It is kind of interesting. So as what? It's a form for action or place of things. So now we have the or. It isn't both, description, not prescription. This kind of tripped me up a little bit because when I did see the or, I was thinking, well, is he saying either or? But I mean, obviously he's not. I think, yeah, he's just describing it as a form for action or a place of things. He's not prescribing what it ought to be. So here I also get the sense that Peterson is getting down to basics, to axioms, the simplest things, the building blocks, the foundation from which he can build a structure to better elucidate what is going on. So is this really the simplest he could have started with? I don't think so, but it seems good enough. I mean, I'm sure he contemplated that. It definitely seems good enough, and I'm willing to hop on this train right here at construing the world validly as a forum for action or as a place of things. So the world can be construed as forum for action, place of things. Like I said, I'm going to go over this 2 or 3 times for each sentence, basically, to make sure that as I'm reading it, I'm understanding it and I'm processing it. And I might even go through it 2 or 3 different types of ways so that, you know, it's kind of helpful to do that if you're going to understand something, especially if the sentences can get rather long and complicated. It's good to break them down into their constituent parts. So I just thought, as an aside, it was interesting that he used the word construed here. And you might think, what are you doing going into the actual, you know, words that he's using in the first sentence? But it is the first sentence. You know, these are one of the most important parts of the book when you're laying out your philosophical foundations. But so I kind of looked up construed to see, does it mean what I remember it to mean, what I think it means, what I, you know, sometimes you don't even know what a word means, you just kind of use it. So instead of interpreted or understood, he could have said those things, you know, or any number of other words that kind of mean that same thing. I looked up the etymology, and it suggests roots in arranging words in their natural order, or to relate grammatically. A natural order of words. A grammar, if you will, of being. A grammar of being. A word that was made flesh. The symbolic made into fullness. The word man, the symbol, man, M-A-N, into a man. The tetragrammaton into the fullness of the living, eternal God. I thought that was very interesting, and I get all that just from him using construed there, and I don't think you're going to get that kind of thing anywhere else. I did see another video on this topic. I watched about half of it, but I just wasn't really interested that much in it. One thing that bugs me is when people read like from a script when they're doing a video, and I've done that myself too, but it's just I try not to do it. I wouldn't do every video reading from a script. I think it's much better to try to interact with someone. That's why I have my little face up here in the corner. I think that's why Paul Vanderklay has a lot of success in his YouTube videos, because you can see him, you want to see a person, and you want to talk to a person. And for me, as I'm just getting into this, Vanderklay has hundreds of videos, and he mentioned me recently in a video, which I have to thank him. I have to write him a message to thank him about that, because it was a really wonderful message. It was a wonderful shout out for my channel, and I got quite a few subscribers for my little channel just starting out. But anyway, let's move on to the next thing. So Sam Harris versus Jordan, I kind of already been mentioning that. I just want to make sure I didn't forget that. And again, I want to break this down. Okay, this is the next sentence, I think. Form for action. The former manner of interpretation, more primordial and less clearly understood, finds its expression in the arts or humanities, in ritual, drama, literature, and mythology. The world as a forum for action is a place of value, a place where all things have meaning. This meaning, which is shaped as a consequence of social interaction, is implication for action, or at a higher level of analysis, implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. And so you might get lost in that, so that's why I broke it down. What is a forum for action? It's more primordial, less clearly understood. I guess you can say definitely from a materialist perspective, it seems primordial. It definitely seems less clearly understood. It's expressed in the arts or humanities, in ritual, drama, literature, and mythology. The forum for action. Now, all of those things, the ritual, the drama, the literature, and the mythology, that's all encompassed in religion. Now, he doesn't say that there, but he definitely breaks down religion right there. It's a place of value. It's a place, underlined, highlighted, where all things, underlined, highlighted, have meaning, underlined, highlighted. Place, things, meaning. A place where all things have meaning. The forum for action. It's primordial, less clearly understood, expressed in the arts and humanities, ritual, drama, literature, mythology. All of that's in religion. It's a place where all things have meaning. Well, let's get on to what's the meaning. Meaning is shaped as a consequence of social interaction, is implication for action. Or, and he says, what does he say more technically? At a higher level of analysis. Now here he is breaking down levels of analysis. The higher level of analysis, and this is a complicated one, is implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. I think that sounds precise. It sounds sciencey. May even sound philosophical. It's definitely a mouthful. So it is the implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. That's what meaning is. Meaning is the implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. Well, I just broke that down a little bit more right here. Push Sam Harris off the stage. That's what they laughed about, him and Dillahunty. That would be the action, right? So that's the action that's rooted in an interpretive schema. The interpretive schema is configured by an implication, and the implication is from meaning. That's just another way of breaking down that sentence. So the world as place of things. The formal expression in methods and theories of science. Now I believe that goes back. I didn't read the rest of that page. I probably should have. Let me see if I can go back. Where is it? Nope. Slide 24. So here we go. The latter manner of interpretation, the world as a place of things, finds its formal expression in the methods and theories of science. Science allows for increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable properties of things, and for efficient utilization of precisely determined things as tools, once the direction such use is to take has been determined through application of more fundamental narrative processes. I'll read that paragraph again. The latter manner of interpretation, the world as a place of things, as opposed to a form for action, finds its formal expression in the methods and theories of science. Science allows for increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable properties of things, and for efficient utilization of precisely determined things as tools, once the direction such use is to take has been determined through application of more fundamental narrative processes. And I think I break that down in a couple of slides, and then we're going to get into this last paragraph, which I might as well read now, unless I have it. I don't think I have it further on. So no complete world picture can be generated without use of both modes of construal. The fact that one mode is generally set at odds with the other means only that the nature of their respective domains remains insufficiently discriminated. Adherents of the mythological worldview tend to regard the statements of their creeds as indistinguishable from empirical fact, even though such statements were generally formulated long before the notion of objective reality emerged. That's so important to understand. Those who, by contrast, accept the scientific perspective, who assume that it is or might become complete, forget that an impassable gulf currently divides what is from what should be, the is-ought problem. All right, let's see if I'll probably have to go back to that at some point. So the world as place of things is formal expression in methods and theories of science. So science is underpinned, this is something that it's not said there, but you have to understand that science is underpinned by this philosophical belief in a world of things that can be known out there. Like, these are all your presuppositions. One, there's a world of things. Two, that I can know the world of things. And three, it's outside myself. It's not just a mental world of things. A lot of people don't understand that there are so many assumptions to science. That's why in world history, if you look at, I think Charles Murray has a great book about human accomplishment. I think it's called Human Accomplishment. If you read that book, one of the insights he has that I think is really interesting, he tries to understand human accomplishment and why the West, Western Europe and America and so forth, seems to out-science the rest of the world. Like, why didn't the East come up with the scientific revolution, anything like that? And it's what makes it so interesting is that the East was so far ahead of the West before the scientific revolution, like let's say the Middle Ages. They had, and he lists all the ways that the East was superior. They had a superior civilization in terms of government, or societal order, commerce. Like, there was so much going on. They had naval ships like 10 times the size of England's and so forth. Like, they were extremely sophisticated society, but they did not have, and they even had technology, like gunpowder was there and so forth. They had technology, so they're even technologically perhaps superior than the West, but they never got the scientific revolution. Nothing kicked off there. And Murray breaks this down in detail through like 400 pages. But the detail that I want to mention here that brings us back to this, the underpinnings of science, is that St. Thomas Aquinas uttered something very powerful into the church and into history, world history. He said that he basically gave the okay to do scientific investigation by saying that it's good to know the thoughts of God after him. You have the thoughts of God that's sort of creating and sustaining the world, and it's a good pursuit to know that. And that is what Murray kind of he draws a lot of lines and graphs and stuff in his book. But to me, that really stood out, that was a tipping point for the West, that all of a sudden, now the snowball started to form and started to go downhill and started to pick up everything with it. And to know the thoughts of God after him. And this did not happen in the Middle East. In fact, it was actively worked against after a certain period of time. Anyway, just read Human Accomplishment. It's definitely interesting to look into. So the underpinnings of science, there's a philosophy behind science, and people don't often understand that there's a Christian philosophy and a Christian philosopher, a theologian, Thomas Aquinas, who put this idea out there into history. And if it wasn't for him, this is one of the points Murray makes, history is not inevitable. A scientific revolution is not inevitable. If it wasn't him, people think, oh, it would be someone else. Not the case. Not the case at all. And if it wasn't for St. Thomas Aquinas, we might not have ever had a scientific revolution. Theology might not have evolved the way it did, and so forth. Anyway, it's really interesting. So now let's get to this point about science. Science allows for the increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable properties of things. And here I want to cite William Blake's / Northrop Frye's least common denominator, LCD reality. And I've gone over this, I think, I must have gone over it in Fearful Symmetry Fridays #2 about the destruction of the individual. I think I've gone over it in the missing link. I tried to go over that, and as I make these videos, I'm trying to understand these concepts. I'm trying to take my understanding, to verbalize them, and to make them understandable to you, perhaps who've never heard of them before. I don't know, who you are. But, so this is interesting. So, allows for the increasingly precise determination. So I've talked about the LCD reality before, and I'm going to try to talk about it again, hopefully in a more clear way, hopefully in a more succinct way, or a more elucidating way as I gain experience in talking to this web camera. It's very difficult to talk to a web camera, by the way, because you're used to having a conversation with someone, and so there's an interplay, a give and take, and Jordan Peterson talks about this when he gives speeches to audiences. He's not just giving a speech to the crowd. If I look at the camera, I might as well look at a crowd. It's a machine face. It's an unchanging nothing. But he's looking at individuals in the crowd to see if they understand. And that's just something I have to get used to or try to do with my web camera, to see if you understand. And there's no way to know if you understand unless you leave a comment, I guess. But that's after the fact. Anyway. So the LCD, the least common denominator reality. So what William Blake says and what Northrop Frye tries to bring into our modern world is that the consensually validatable world, what we know as objective truth, is one that destroys all variation in what is perceived, and in so doing destroys all variation in the perceiver themselves. So Blake uses the example of the guinea sun. So some say, they told him, they hold up the coin, the guinea, it's the yellow coin, the golden coin, and saying, doesn't the sun look like a guinea? And they hold it up, and he goes, he doesn't see a mere yellow disc. He says he sees an innumerable host of the heavenly host singing, glory be to God, right? Hallelujah, hallelujah, right? So it's the hallelujah chorus version of the sun, and that's William Blake's vision of the sun, his vision of the sun, his perception of the sun. And what Locke was, and so Blake was writing against Locke, and what Locke was doing was trying to objectify reality. And so you might have Blake high up in perceptions with imaginative perceptions, and then you might have an idiot who doesn't really see much of anything, and then you have this mediocrity, this in-between. You cut off the genius, you cut out the idiot, and you have this mediocre least common denominator reality, where everybody sees this just this yellow disk in the sun, the Guinea sun, and every other interpretation is weeded out, and every other sort of brain or being is weeded out too, because everybody has to conform. I think Kierkegaard wrote about this with the masked man. The masked man, I tried to find that quote, I couldn't find it. But there's a beautiful quote in Kierkegaard, I forget which book it is, it might be The Sickness Unto Death, where he talks about the masked man. And so everybody conforms to this objective reality, and you can, when you start to conform, you lose your imaginative sight, your vision, your poetic genius, and you can no longer see what might be out there. You can only see what everybody else agrees to. And that's sort of what Sam Harris is demanding from Jordan Peterson, and what they demand for society, that we as a society only see the scientific view. We only see the objective reality. Jordan's saying, look, there's this other picture here. You're not taking into account what it is to be human. And they say, no, no, no. They wag their finger at him saying, we have machines that can see this. We're just more, we're wet machines. And this is all there is to see. They're not really taking into account a lot of things that we know in philosophy. I think the word is the noumena. I think Kant talked about it. What it is actually to be out there. And I'll get into that in another video because it's too complicated to go into here. But I hope that that's a little bit. I think I have a slide about this on the next slide is about the least common denominator. But so science allows for the increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable least common denominator properties of things. The Guinea sun. The sun is just a yellow disk. It allows for the efficient use of things as tools. But even this is not determined by science, or even in its scope, as it is determined, Blake would say imagined, through application of more fundamental narrative processes. Art, ethics, literature all lead to the biblical narrative, and this is the fundamental narrative that I think Jordan Peterson is getting at. That so you run through this narrative to determine what you're going to do with your things as tools. You don't know what to do with your things as tools. Science does not tell you what to do with it. It's this narrative that you're running through your thought process, through your being, running through that narrative, and through that, the filter of the narrative, you then can decide what is the proper use for your tools that you've discovered or created with science. Science itself being a tool. Thomas Aquinas saying it's okay to use this tool. It's okay to use the mind to discover these things, to further this way of thinking. So here, this is the slide I got from The Fearful Symmetry, talking about the Guinea sun. I talked about the genius and the idiot being eliminated. You have this little mediocrity, this averaged, generalized, impersonal, abstracted idea of the sun becomes what the sun is. Once the perception has been reduced and abstracted enough, once you do that enough times with enough people, enough things, it has become atomized to the most common bits. That's what atoms are, the least common bits. So too will the perceiver. The perceiver himself will become atomized. Every eye will be replaceable. Every brain replaceable. Man will become identical instead of individual. Each mind and eye will become interchangeable with any other. The individual becomes an indivisible and invariable unit. He becomes an atom himself. And that's the frightening thing that Blake rails against, that Kierkegaard rails against. You can't let this happen. And this is also the struggle I think Jordan's having with Sam Harris. This struggle is continuing, and I think it all comes back to the biblical narrative itself. So he says, no complete world picture without use of both myth and science. That was that last paragraph. They're at odds only because each domain has not been sufficiently discriminated. Adherents to narrative see it as fact. So you might say the Bible science people, the people who believe in young earth, They see the narrative as fact. And Sam Harris sees everything as fact. It's yes, no, it's there, it's not. God exists or does not exist. It's a yes or no proposition, true or false. While science or scientism adherents believe what is equals what should be. The ought from is problem, the is ought problem. So they kind of have reversed roles. Narrative should have the what should be as part of it, and discard the fact part as much as possible. Of course there are facts in your narrative. You know, there was a Pontius Pilate, there was a historical Jesus, and so forth. Although some people rail against that too. And science should instead deal with the facts. So Peterson says, look, here's the problem. The wires are crossed. There's problems because the domains have not been sufficiently discriminated. And I think in his talks with Sam Harris, he's trying to sufficiently discriminate. And again, I haven't heard the talks, but this is my theory, what I think is going to happen. Trying to sufficiently discriminate the two domains. He's trying to put Sam Harris back in his domain and say, this is not your domain. Your domain is facts. And what the domain of ethics and what should be it belongs to narrative. It does not belong to science. To me, it just makes so much sense. To me, it's almost like common sense. But maybe that's just the way I've been brought up and the things that I've read and studied that make it seem that way. So now I want to get a little bit further from the actual first page of Maps of Meaning, of Mo Meaning, for Mo Meaning Mondays. And I'm just going to push it a little bit further, and this is just something that came to my mind as I was reading this. It's not directly off the page. This is from Northrop Frye. But it does, I think, deal with it, and I think it's able to shed some light on what's happening with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson as well. So according to Northrop Frye, science assumes two levels of sense perception, and I equate these sort of to layers of knowledge, if you will. The first is an accidental level of sense perception, and the second is ideal, the ideal sense perception. It is by accident that we as beings on this planet perceive the sun rising over us during the day and setting on the horizon in the evening. So that's an accidental level of perception. It's only by pure accident that we have the phrase sunrise and sunset. Those are metaphors that are technically inaccurate. It's accidental that they appear that way to us. If we imagine a place of the planet, say on the space station, we would have access to the ideal perception of sunrise and sunset. And we would then know that the truth, the fact, this is what Sam Harris gets at, the scientific truth, the fact, is not in the metaphors of sunrise and sunset. Those Sam Harris wants to discard completely. But in this new perception of the Earth rotating around its axis and further going around the sun itself. So there's accidental and there's ideal levels of sense perception. I just described some examples of that. So what science does is not destroy the truth in metaphor, in myth, but it destroys the accidental truth in it, not the ideal. I thought this was very interesting the way Frye thought about this. So the accidental is the sunrise. We say it's metaphorical. It's sufficiently true over here. The phrase, the metaphor, is sufficiently true enough that it works for us. We understand what we're talking about to each other. We can use it in language, and it's useful to us. And it's from the surface of the planet. Now, in reality, science would say this is actually false as a fact. It's factually false. But what's necessarily true, this is the ideal. Sunrise is from the space station. This is scientifically a true fact. We would see in the ideal part of sunrise from the space station that we would see the true fact instead of the false, sufficiently true sunrise metaphor. So science proves false only that which is accidental in metaphor. It does not touch, nor can it ever touch, upon the ideal truths expressed in metaphor. And this is what I was going back, my claim back in the very beginning of this video about metaphor and myth shows us that science is just another story. I wanted to say that, people say science proves myth and metaphor false, and Fry says, well, it's actually, they just prove the accidental parts false, not the ideal parts. And I wanted to say that, well, actually myth, this is something I'm thinking about, and metaphor proves science false. But I said in the beginning that it proves that it's just another story, and that's something I'm working on. And like I said here, this is something I'm mulling over for another video. And by the way, this video that, like I said, I want to do Meaning Mondays every Monday. This video I've actually been working on in my spare time for like 2 weeks. And what I found is there are depths that I kind of go down these rabbit holes, and I think they stray a little bit too far from the text sometimes. And I'm going to have to just, whatever I have complete in a week, I'm going to put out as, let's say, part 1 of a video. And if there's more, I'll continue working on it during the next week, and I'll put it out as part 2 and so forth until there's a complete part. So I want to, again, keep that rhythm of the channel Mondays and Fridays. I want to at least keep those videos out. Never mind these other random videos that I'm thinking about, metaphor and myth, and this thing Fry is talking about. So science proves accidental what's in metaphor. Okay? And I'm thinking that science, yes, proves accidental what's in metaphor, but then metaphor proves what's accidental in science. I don't want to get too far into this. This is, again, just something I'm mulling over and thinking about, and I actually have a very elaborate diagram of this drawn out in one of my notebooks that it kind of rivals some of Peterson's crazy diagrams that people don't seem to understand, although I think they're kind of clear. But this diagram is just off the wall crazy to try to illustrate this, because there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. Science illustrates for us what is accidentally true in metaphor. Okay, we've said that many times. I hope you understand that point. Metaphor illustrates for us what is accidentally true in science, in the material world. That's what I think. I think that's where Fry should go with it next. And I think I'm actually going to touch on this with Fearful Symmetry number 4. Fearful Symmetry Fridays number 4. I was going to get in touch with that part. Science points us towards the ideal perception from which knowledge is gleaned. Okay, that space station perception of the sunrise. Metaphor points us towards the ideal from which perception becomes vision. And this is odd language. This is like sort of Blakean language. Metaphor points us towards the, I don't know how to phrase this, but right now I'm just saying towards the ideal from which perception becomes vision. And again, this is something I'm going to go over in a video. I think I titled it Metaphor and Epistemology. And there's a lot of stuff to cover in this, and a lot of Nietzsche comes into this, and a lot of Jung. But I hope to get to that. But anyway, this was Meaning Monday number 1, where I went over the index, the first page of Maps of Meaning, and a little bit of the preface. If you stuck around now past an hour, God bless you. Please subscribe and like, and maybe even comment on the videos. Share them. Help the channel grow. Thanks a lot.